When we picture the ocean, we often imagine a vast blue depth, but most marine life actually lives most closer to land, on the continental shelf. This area is submerged edge of the continent and it's absolutely teeming with life. It's where sunlight, nutrients, and gentle slopes combine to create some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Over the next few slides, we'll explore what makes the zone so biologically diverse, how it varies from place to place, and why it is so vital to humans and marine organisms alike. The continental shelf forms the true underwater extensions of the land. It starts right off the low tide marks and stretches outwards to what we call the shelf break, that sharp drop off leading to the deep ocean floor. Because of this area stays completely submerged, it serves as the main habitat for benthic or bottom dwelling organisms. The slope here is gradual, unlike the steep shelf break, which allows light to reach the seafloor and support diverse life forms from burrowing worms to giant kelp forests. The continental shelf looks very different depending on where you are on Earth. On active continental margins, like along the Pacific coast, the shelf is narrow because the tectonic plates are colliding and pushing land upwards. On passive margins, such as the Atlantic coast, the shelf can stretch for hundreds of kilometers. On average, the shelf break sits around 150 meters deep, shallow compared to the rest of the ocean. This region is incredibly valuable, not just ecologically, but economically. It holds oil, gas, and fisheries that sustain millions of people. In fact, the United Nations established that each nation controls the marine resources up to 200 nautical miles from its coast, a policy that ensures these critical ecosystems are protected from overexploitation. Now let's talk about what makes the environment so dynamic. The continental shelf's water experiences far more temperature changes than the deep ocean. Because waves and currents mix the water constantly, heat from the surface distributes throughout the entire water column. That mixing prevents extreme temperatures, layering, or stratification, and helps spread nutrients and oxygen. The result is a well balanced habitat that supports everything from plankton blooms to massive fish populations. Turbulence is the heartbeat of the shelf ecosystem. The energy from the waves and currents stirs the water so thoroughly that it stays well mixed on top to bottom. Nutrients can't settle and get trapped in the sediment the way that they do here in the deeper waters. Instead, they're recycled continuously, fueling plankton growth and feeding the food web from the ground up. Without this constant movement, the continental shelf would lose much of its fertility and biodiversity. The same turbulence that mixes the water also stirs up sediment, which makes the water less transparent. But murky water doesn't mean lifeless. In fact, the opposite is true. These suspended particles carry nutrients from rivers, estuaries, and decaying matter. Detritus from the nearby communities like seagrass, meadows, and kelp forests also contributes to the mixture. Now that we've covered the physical features, let's talk about the life on the continental shelf. These habitats are incredibly diverse because the seafloor changes from place to place. Some areas are soft and sandy, others are rocky and rugged, and some are covered with dense seagrass or towering kelp. Each type of habitat creates its own community. On the shelf, we find four main types: soft bottom subtidal zones, seagrass meadows, hard bottom subtidal zones, and kelp forests. Together, they form the mosaic of ecosystems that connects coastal life to the deep ocean. Soft bottom areas dominate most of the continental shelf. These are sandy or muddy environments where organisms can't anchor themselves easily. Sessile or permanently anchored species are rare here, but there's no hard surface to cling to. Instead, we see a mix of infauna, which are animals that burrow in the sediment, and epifauna, those are that live on top of it. There's also meiofauna, microscopic life that thrives between the grains of the sand. The diversity here is so high but patchy because conditions like sediment size and water flow vary even across short distances. There aren't many places or large seaweeds, though benthic diatoms living on sediment grains adds a quite but crucial layer of primary protection. A fascinating part of this ecosystem is how new life finds its home. Many benthic species, including crabs and barnacles, begin as drifting planktonic larvae. They eventually settle to the bottom, but where they settle depends on environmental cues. Things like temperature, salinity, and even the type of seafloor plays a role. Some larvae can't detect chemical signals that guide them towards the right spot. For example, crab larvae are drawn to chemicals released by sea urchins, while barnacles larvae respond to substances released by adults on their own species. It's like each species has its own unique homing beacon. In unvegetated soft bottom regions, we find a wide array of burrowers and bottom dwelling animals. The infauna include worms and clams that live within the sediment, while the epifauna, these little brittle stars and sea pens, occupy the surface. Demersal fish, meaning fish that swim close to the seafloor, patrol these areas looking for food. Even though these habitats look barren at first glance, they're full of life below the surface. Every burrow, tube, and mound tells the story of organisms engineering their environment and recycling nutrients back into the ecosystem. The animals in the soft bottom habitat play vital ecological roles. Epifauna such as amphipods, shrimp, and brittle stars roaming across the surface, while infauna like clams and sandworms and swells burrow deep within them. Some species like heart urchins and parchment worms reshape the sediment as they move, improving oxygen flow and nutrient cycling. These communities might not have coral reefs or kelp canopies, but they're just as essential, forming the foundation for much of what the shelf's biodiversity. Between the grains of sand on the ocean floor live the entire hidden world called the meiofauna. These are microscopic animals that occupy the tiny spaces between the sediment particles. They include nematodes, copepods, and even tiny worms that are so small they move between the grains like we move between buildings. Many meiofauna species are found nowhere else on Earth. They form the link between bacteria and larger invertebrates, playing a vital role in breaking down organic matter and keeping the seafloor ecosystems running efficiently. Now let's talk about how these benthic creatures actually eat. The two main feeding types here are deposit feeders and suspension feeders. Deposit feeders like sea cucumbers and some worms feed on organic material that settle on the sea floor, essentially eating their way through the sediment. Suspension feeders such as clams and some tube worms filter food particles directly from the water column. The environment determines which group dominates. In calmer, muddier areas with less oxygen and more detritus, deposit feeders rule. In sandier, more turbulent areas with plenty of oxygen, suspension feeders thrive. Bioturbators are the engineers of the seafloor. These are the burrowers, diggers, and stirrers that constantly reshape the sediment. Think of polychaete worms, burrowing clams, skates, stingrays, and even whales distributing the ocean floor as they feed. Their movement helps oxygenate sediment and recycle nutrients, preventing the buildup of toxic gases and keeping the benthic ecosystems healthy. Without bioturbators, sediments would become compacted and lifeless. So even though these animals may go unnoticed, they are quietly maintaining the balance of the shelf's community. Next, we move into one of the most beautiful and productive habitats on the continental shelf, the seagrass meadows. Over 50 species exist worldwide, thriving in shallow, sheltered waters with plenty of light and soft sediment. In tropical regions, turtle grass dominates, while in temperate zones, eelgrass is more common. These meadows are biodiversity hotspots, supporting fish, invertebrate turtles, and countless microorganisms. Seagrass meadows are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Their dense root network stabilizes sediment and prevents erosion. The plants themselves provide food for grazers like turtles and sea urchins, but most of their productivity actually enters the food web as detritus, which is decaying leaves that feed on bacteria and decomposers. This detritus supports an entire community of detrivores and filter feeders. Beyond their ecological role, seagrass meadows are also carbon sinks, storing large amounts of blue carbon that help regulate our climate. Not all parts of the continental shelf are soft and sandy. In some places, like rocky outcrops or submerged cliffs, form hard bottom habitats. These environments are much less common but incredibly rich in life. Here we find an abundance of epifauna, animals that live attached to or crawl over the hard surfaces, along with seaweeds that thrive when sunlight penetrates. Hard-bottom communities resemble rocky intertidal zones but are always submerged, meaning organisms here don't face drying out or extreme temperature shifts. The result is a dense three-dimensional habitat full of color and complexity. The hard-bottom environment is also a great place to explore predator-prey relationships. Before sea otters rebounded along California's coasts, crabs were abundant, and grazers like small snails and isopods that eat the algae were scarce. The seagrass beds were healthy but heavily stressed by epiphytes, which are algae that grow on the surface of the grass blades. When sea otters made their comeback in the 1990s, they began preying on crabs. With fewer crabs, the grazers increased and began eating epiphytes that were smothering the seagrass. That release of the seagrass from the competitors allowed it to flourish. This classic example of trophic cascade shows how one predator can reshape the entire ecosystem. Now we move on to one of the most spectacular habitats on Earth, the kelp forests. These towering underwater forests are formed by brown algae known as kelp, which are restricted to cold, nutrient-rich waters. They grow only on rocky bottoms where their holdfast can anchor securely. Kelp grow incredibly fast, up to 20 inches a day, and form dense canopies that provide food and shelter for a wide variety of organisms. These forests are among the most productive ecosystems on the planet, reviving tropic rainforests in biodiversity. One of the smaller kelp species, Laminaria, is common in North Atlantic and North Pacific. It reaches about 3 meters in height and often forms dense beds in cooler waters. While smaller than giant kelp, Laminaria still provide crucial habitat for fish, crustaceans, and invertebrates. Its blades create shelter for juvenile species while it decays contributes to detritus that feed bottom-dwelling decomposers. These smaller kelp forests are like nurseries for marine life, sustaining local food webs. Then we have the giant of them all, Macrocystis pyrifera, the giant kelp. It can grow over 30 meters tall and form massive underwater forests along the Pacific coast and North and South America. These kelp forests create complex layered habitats that support hundreds of species from the tiny amphipods to sea otters and harbor seals. The canopy provides cover for fish, the understory shelters invertebrates, and the holdfast anchors a miniature world of its own. When species of kelp break off, they become drifting kelp, which feed deep-water organisms that never see sunlight. The distribution of kelp forests around the world is shaped by the ocean circulation patterns. Warm surface currents flow westward along the equator before turning towards the poles, while cold currents return from the polar regions towards the equator. These cold, nutrient-rich waters are where kelp thrive. That's why we find kelp forests along places like southern Australia, New Zealand, the coast of Chile and Argentina, the Pacific coast and North America, western Russia, and parts of northern Europe, as well as southern Africa. Wherever these cold upwelling occurs, kelp forests bloom, creating oases of life in the temperate seas. Kelp forests are dynamic layered ecosystems with incredibly high species diversity. They're arranged both horizontally across the distance from shores and vertically through the water column. Near shore, smaller species like Laminaria and feather boa kelp dominate. As you move seaward, giant kelp take over, forming dense canopies that stretch across the surface. Farther offshore, eel kelp and other deep-dwelling species occupy the dimmer zones. Vertically, we find 3 main layers: algal turf at the bottom, understory kelp rising upwards with the light, and the surface canopy that captures the sunlight. This layering creates countless niches supporting fishes, invertebrates, and mammals that all depend on the structures kelp provides. The kelp forest is divided into 3 main horizontal zones: the inshore zone, the kelp canopy, and the offshore zone. The inshore zone, closest to the shore, supports shorter species like the feather boa and other shorter species. The kelp canopy is the most recognizable part, which is a dense floating mat of Macrocystis fronds that form the forest roof. It's teeming with life, from sea otters resting on the kelp to fish darting across the fronds. The offshore zone contains species like eel kelp, sea stars, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers. The entire community functions like a multi-story building, with each level offering different resources and shelter. Kelp forests aren't just beautiful, they're ecologicly vital. They provide food and energy as well as habitat for hundreds of species and protect coastlines from erosion by dampening waves' energies. Sea urchins, the main grazers, feed on kelp holdfasts, and in moderation, they help maintain balance. If urchin populations explode, they can strip entire forests down to bare rock, creating what's called an urchin barren. Drifting kelp, the pieces that break off and sink, also play an important role by feeding deep sea organisms, recycling energy far beyond forest. This brings us to one of the best known examples of trophic cascade in the marine ecology. Before 1985, sea otters weren't abundant along the Aleutian Islands. They kept sea urchin populations under control, allowing lush kelp forests to thrive. But around 1985, orcas began preying on otters, drastically reducing their numbers. With fewer otters, sea urchins boomed and overgrazed the kelp, leading to massive declines in forest density in 1997. Graphs from long-term studies show a clear pattern. As otters decreased, sea urchins increased, and the kelp vanished. It's a perfect illustration of how removing a top predator can unravel an entire ecosystem.